So today our topic is, has India overtaken Japan to become fourth largest economy is our topic. So I request you to start speaking, sir.
All right. So thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Uh, it is, you see, about 10 days back that suddenly the Niti Aayog Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Subramaniam, he said that India now has become the fourth largest economy in the world. And the Prime Minister was speaking in Gujarat, and he also made the same statement that India has become the fourth largest economy in the world. And what is the basis? Mr. Subramanian explained that the IMF brings out the World Economic Outlook. For 25-26, it has projected that India will become the fourth largest economy in the world. Now, when we say that it is estimated that it will happen, then this is based on the current GDP and the growth rate of the GDP for the current time. But you see, both of these, the current GDP and the current rate of growth, are both uncertain. However, what the IMF is saying is that by the end of 2025, India will become a $4.187.017 trillion economy. Okay, and this is going to be 0.586 billion more than Japan. That means India will be 0.014% ahead of the GDP of Japan. Now, this is a very small gap. And also, it is not that India has already crossed. India will cross Japan's GDP by the end of the year, that is in December 2025. So the question is, why make this inaccurate statement? Because it could easily have been said that by the end of the year, that is in December 2025, India will become the fourth largest economy. So we have to understand why this is happening. And also, this is ignoring the fact that in per capita terms, we are 1/12 of Japan. So even though the GDP may be the same, roughly the same as Japan, slightly ahead, but we will still be in per person, we will be 1/12 of what is Japan. Okay, so what I will be doing is I will be making this presentation in two parts. The first part will be what are the issues with GDP estimation, and the second part will be comparing India's development with Japan's development to see what does it mean to be the fourth largest. How do we compare with Japan? So I'll begin with the first one, and I'll point out that there are 5 issues with the first, that is the estimation of GDP. Mr. Viraya. So first point is, why are the Niti Aayog people using the IMF projection? Why not India's data itself? And I think that is because, you see, it has been argued that India's GDP has many problems and errors. So in a way, it is an attempt to gain credibility by naming IMF, that we are using IMF data. And the second is that why are we announcing that we are already the fourth largest, when that will be by the end of December? And I think that has to do with trying to create a positive image after the Operation Sindoor. Because after Operation Sindoor, the government is trying to create some kind of positivity in the country. And the issue, therefore, is that why depend on IMF? Because IMF does not collect data. IMF simply takes the government data, and therefore it uses the government data only. It only, maybe adds 0.1%, 0.2% here and there, but broadly it is the government data. So all the errors of the government data are also in the IMF data. So none of the international agencies like IMF, World Bank, ADB, they don't collect data. They're only using government data. Mr. Viraya. Second, the world economy is passing through grave uncertainty ever since President Trump has been elected, and ever since he's taken over on January 20th. So the GDP and the growth rate of the world economy and of the different economies has been very uncertain. We don't know what is likely to happen. So using uncertain data to make the projection is itself a problem. And why is there uncertainty? We have a problem with inflation. If Trump levies these high tariffs, there'll be supply bottlenecks, which will lead to further inflation. And then there is a possibility of a recession if the prices rise and the exports decline for all the countries. There is also uncertainty regarding the stock market, which has been in turmoil, going up and down. The currencies have been impacted, different currencies have been impacted differently. First, the dollar was strengthening, and now the dollar has declined. The gold prices have gone up, interest rates are impacted, and investment and growth are therefore being impacted. So therefore, there's a lot of uncertainty about inflation, about growth, about different currencies and gold, etc. So we don't know which economy will be affected by how much. And therefore, a projected difference of 0.014% in GDP can easily turn out to be incorrect. Japan may not be growing as much, or India may not be growing as much. For instance, if India is projected to grow at 6.2% and instead it becomes 6.1%, then we will not cross Japan by the end of the year. Similarly, if the rupee is depreciated more than the yen, then again, our GDP will not go up in dollar terms as much. So there are so many uncertainties. So in the past also, the IMF projections have turned out to be incorrect. The biggest example is in 2008, when the global financial crisis was there. Then we saw that the IMF kept predicting that the world economy will keep on growing, whereas the experts were saying that the economy is heading into recession. It's only when the Lehman brothers collapsed in September 2008 that they said that the world economy is going into recession. So, in other words, in the past also we have seen that it's not as if the IMF predictions have been correct. And in the World Economic Report, which is where the prediction for GDP has been made, there also on page 3 there is a graph which shows that all the uncertainties have increased in trade, in growth, and so on. So the IMF is not taking into account these uncertainties in making the projections, and that's why the projections may turn out to be incorrect. In India, the GDP estimation is very complicated because there is the public sector, the private sector, and then the private sector is divided between the organized and the unorganized sector. And then there is the agriculture, industry, services, and all that. So what happens is that what we get initially are only a little bit of data that we are getting. And on the basis of that, we make the estimates. So these are called advanced estimates. So you have the first advanced estimate, second advanced estimate, then the provisional estimate, then the revised estimate, and then the final estimate. So the final data for a given year comes almost 2 years later. So therefore, at the moment, we are only dealing with the revised estimates and the provisional estimates, not with the final estimates. And at times, there has been a big revision between the advanced estimates and the final estimates of more than even 1%. So therefore, we cannot claim till 2027 that our GDP has crossed that of the Japan in 2025, because the final estimates will come only by 2027. So the fourth point is that Indian economy has gone through 4 shocks since the demonetization of 2016-17. We had demonetization, then the structurally faulty GST, then the NBFC crisis, and then the sudden lockdown. Now, when we estimate the GDP, according to the government document, we project from the previous year. But when there is a shock, then the projection from the previous year will give us the wrong figure. And then we are also using from the past the benchmark. Now, the benchmark changes when there's a shock. So therefore, projecting from the previous year and using the benchmark actually is inaccurate, because it'll give us a higher GDP than actually the case may be. And then we project for the next year, then again from a higher GDP, we will get a higher GDP. So in other words, what is happening is that we foul up the entire GDP by overestimating it. And the biggest example of that was that in 2016-17, during demonetization, everybody saw that the markets were not operating, industry was closed, and so on. And therefore, there was a negative growth, not a positive growth. And yet, the government's official data shows an 8% growth, the highest growth of that decade. Mr. So, this error that is there in the GDP estimation, there is something category called discrepancy. That is like a error that is there between different ways of measuring the GDP. Now, this discrepancy has shot up. Until the year of demonetization, it used to be small, at the most maybe 0.5, 0.7%. But now it has gone up very high. It has gone up to even 2.7%. And in some year it is positive, and in some year it is negative. It is going back and forth. So that shows that the production side approach, which is taken to be the correct approach, itself has big errors. So therefore, discrepancies will also have big errors. So the GDP measurement, this shows the discrepancy being high, shows that our way of measuring the GDP is having problems. We find finally that the shocks, have disturbed the methodology of estimation of GDP. And therefore, there is an overestimation of GDP. And why is that further aggravated? Because in the economy, we have the private sector where there's an organized sector and an unorganized sector. But the GDP quarterly estimates are based on very limited organized sector data. So not only the unorganized sector data is very sparse, but even the organized sector data is very sparse for the thing. So what we do is we proxy the unorganized sector by using the little bit of organized sector data that we are getting. But we know that the unorganized sector was hit hard by demonetization, by the GST, and by the NBFC crisis, and by the sudden lockdown. So these shocks actually decimated the unorganized sector. So unorganized sector has been declining, and evidence for this has come from various sectors, like in the case of trade. E-commerce has been growing dramatically, but the neighborhood stores are declining. Similarly, in the leather goods sector, similarly in the pressure cooker sector, and so on. So the declining unorganized sector is being proxied by a rising organized sector. So in other words, the decline is being papered over and the rise is being shown. So effectively, our GDP is only showing the organized sector, not the unorganized sector. So that's why I've been arguing that the unorganized sector is invisibilized in our data, and we don't take its decline into account. So we are overestimating the GDP, Mr. Virya. Let us take the example of agriculture. Agriculture is a big component of the unorganized sector, and experts have been saying that our data for agriculture is not accurate. Because if you look at it last year and so on, the government claimed that there was a record crop, and yet, the price of wheat were rising. And then the government had to put stock holding limits. And then also prices kept rising. And then after that, the exports were banned, and yet the prices were rising. So it is suspected that our data on agriculture is not accurate. And that is the problem that the unorganized sector faces, that, the unorganized sector is falling, but, it's represented by the organized sector. Now, as a corollary, you see this decline in the unorganized sector is visible in the aggravation of the unemployment in the country, because 94% are working in the unorganized sector. So if the unorganized sector is declining, then the employment generation will be much less. And if the organized sector is rising at the expense of the unorganized sector, then for every, say, 10 people that are working in the unorganized sector, maybe only 1 or 2 people will be working in the organized sector because it is so automated and so on. Therefore, the number of people working will become less if the demand shifts from the unorganized sector to the organized sector, as seems to be happening. So this unemployment problem reflects the decline in the unorganized sector, and that is not captured in our GDP data, Mr. Giri. So what I've been pointing out is these 5 problems with our GDP and its estimation and the estimation of the growth rate. And that's why, we cannot say that this 0.014% difference between Japan and India will be there at the end of the year. So we cannot be sure about that. But now let me come to the second part, which is a comparison. What does it mean for the average person that we will be better off than Japan in GDP terms? But as I said, in per capita terms, of course, we are going to be way behind Japan. Even if we become equal to Japan in GDP terms, by end of this year, that is December 2025. But our population is 12 times more than Japan. That means per person, we are earning 1/12 of what Japan earns. And this is what shows in the international ranking of per capita income. We are at the 140th place, whereas Japan is at the 34th place. There is a difference in the places of 106. And then Japan is a much more equal society. We are a very unequal society if you look at the wealth inequality, income inequality, and consumption inequality. So, in other words, because Japan is much more equal, those in the bottom half, they are earning much more in proportionate terms than a person in India is earning. And that's why this 1/12, doesn't fully reflect the gap between the per capita income of the poor in Japan versus the poor in India. By poor, I mean the bottom 50%. So this is what the gap is much more as far as the bottom 50% is concerned. It's not like 1/12. It is much more for Japanese people, and that's why in social indicators, uh, India is much worse off than Japan. So whether we think of educational achievements, we think of health status, we think of life and longevity, Japanese are much better off than us. Similarly, in civic amenities, the amenities available in Japan and to the citizen, they are much better. In technological development, they are much superior. That's why the social strife is much lower in Japan than in India. Mr. Virya? Reasons why we are doing much worse than Japan is the problem of unemployment. When we have unemployment, then what it means is that one minute, yeah. What it means is that in the family there are fewer people working, and therefore the dependency ratio in the family increases. That means few people working have to support more people. So Japan has much lower level of unemployment compared to India. For instance, Japan's labor force participation rate is around 63%, while officially India has 56%. So there's a gap of about 7% there. But if you look at the CMIE data, which is based on the ILO definition, then it is less than 50%. So the gap is almost 13% in the labor force participation rate. The question arises, why is India unable to offer more work to its people, especially the women and the educated children? Mr. Bire? So,
Yes.
the reason why we are unable to offer more employment, to women, to educated youth, and why unemployment is high is because by policy we are favoring the capital intensive organized sector, not the unorganized sector, which is labor intensive. So, like farming and small sector and the micro sectors, these are the big employers. 46% are employed in the agriculture sector, and the micro sector and the small sector employ 97.5% of the MSME employment. So if we don't favor the micro sector and the small sector and the agriculture sector, then employment generation will be much less. And what has also been done is that we are trying to formalize the unorganized sector. This policy of formalizing the unorganized sector cannot work because the unorganized sector has very little employment. In the micro sector, average employment is only 1.7 per unit. Now, you cannot make it into formal or organized. It will remain unorganized. You can at best kill it. And that is what has been done deliberately. That's what the government said when demonetization was done. Then the structurally faulty GST was also supposed to formalize. And then the digitization that is being done. All these are damaging the unorganized sector. So the unorganized sector is decreasing and the organized sector output is rising. And that has become the source of great deal of inequality. And when inequality rises, then the people at the bottom, they're not able to demand so much. And then in the market, there's a shortage of demand. And when there's a shortage of demand, then the organized sector itself starts slowing down. As we saw in the period just before the pandemic, that the rate of growth had dropped from 8% to 3.1%, So the organized sector itself starts suffering. Then further, we have been pushing for inclusive banking. Now, what does inclusive banking mean? That the poor people also have bank accounts. So the little bit of saving that they have, they put it in the bank, and from the bank, it is siphoned out to the urban centers like Delhi, Bombay, or to the rich states. So the credit deposit ratio of Bihar is half that of the richer states. That means that Bihar is saving little, and half of that saving is also going out of Bihar. So this inclusive banking also is creating this problem of the unorganized sector and the backwards declining. And what is also happening is that in the budget, we give more funds to the capital intensive sectors and very little to the unorganized sector, like rural employment guarantee scheme, like for instance, agriculture development, rural development, or we have been cutting the proportion of funds going to education and health. So all these labor intensive areas, they have been curtailed, while the capital intensive sectors have been promoted, like freight corridor, like highways, like IT sector and power sector. So all these policies have favored the organized capital intensive sector against the unorganized labor intensive sectors. Mr. Veer, this higher family dependency, unemployment, and the drain of the savings of the poor people to the capitalists and the businessmen is what is resulting in poverty. Now, government is arguing that poverty in India has decreased because they're using the multidimensional poverty line based on the National Health and Family Survey of 2015-16 compared to 2019-21. So, in effect, they are trying to say that the poverty has been reduced. But my argument is that you cannot compare 2015-16 to 2019-21, because in 2021 we had the pandemic and we saw that all the parameters declined. Students could not go to school, health parameters were terrible, a lot of people were dying outside the hospitals, oxygen was not available, etc. So health infrastructure was collapsing, and then incomes had fallen. So on all the three basic parameters, actually things had deteriorated. So how come that the multidimensional poverty actually declined? It could not have declined. So my argument is that that data doesn't seem to be right, and something is wrong. And the problem is that you see poverty we have to define in terms of a poverty line. Multidimensional poverty does not equate to a poverty line. Last time we had one was the Tendulkar Committee in 2004-5, which had given the poverty line. But poverty is defined as minimum social necessary consumption. What is it that a person needs in society? And that need keeps changing. So we need to have a new poverty line. And we have not defined one after 2004-5. So we have to depend, say, on the World Bank international poverty line. That has been raised to $2.15 and now further. But if we go by the $2.15 per person per day World Bank poverty line, then for a family of 5 people, we need 27,400 rupees per month. Whereas, if you look at the data from eShram portal, 90% of the people are saying that they're earning less than 10,000 rupees per month. And similarly, if you look at the data from the Delhi Socioeconomic Survey, then again you find that 90% are earning less than 9,000 rupees per month. So in other words, these are all people who are below the National World Bank poverty line. So some people then say that, okay, we should calculate it on purchasing power parity and not in dollar. But my argument is that purchasing power parity does disservice to the poor people. Why is it that the purchasing power parity is higher than the nominal dollar? It is because the poor people are giving us very cheap services, whether we go to a hotel to eat, whether we take transport, whatever services we consume, they are at very low price. The poverty is the reason why the purchasing power parity for the middle class and the upper classes is better, but the poor people are not consuming those services. So they are not going to restaurants to eat, etc. They are not taking the AC rail travel in the railways, etc. So they are double disservice. They are giving cheap services, so purchasing power parity is high for the upper middle class and so on. But most of the goods being consumed by the poor people are international prices. Whether it be wheat or paddy, etc., those prices are international prices because those are internationally traded. So we should not use purchasing power parity, we should use nominal dollar. And if we do that, then we find that 90% of Indians are poor. They may not be extremely poor, but they're poor by the World Bank poverty line. So to conclude, the poverty in India is worse, much worse than in Japan. It's also because of the inequality that is much higher in India than in Japan. And therefore, what we need to do is my first part, I said that the GDP estimation is incorrect. Now, if the GDP estimation is incorrect, then we can't say that the GDP is the fastest growing economy in the world or among the large economies. And therefore, we cannot say that we have crossed Japan's GDP or that we will be crossing it by the end of 2025. Now, according to me, the government says average rate of growth since the time of demonetization would be 6.5%, but I would say that it will be less than 2.5%. So there is a gap of 4%. Now, if this gap of 4% is there since 2016-17, that means our GDP is 42% less than what is the current GDP that government says. So instead of about $4 trillion, it should be about $2.82 trillion. In which case, Indian economy was not the fifth largest economy till now, and it's not going to be the fourth largest. I think we are probably around the ninth largest economy in the world. So the GDP data we have to reassess, and when we do that, then we'll be reassessing our investment and consumption data. Because the investment and consumption data is also estimated on the basis of GDP data. So we cannot use the IMF data also because the IMF is taking the government data. If the government data has all these errors in GDP and its growth and investment and consumption, those errors will also be there in the IMF's data. So we cannot hide behind saying that IMF data is showing this. And therefore, to finally say, the marginalized sections, for them, these claims of being the fourth largest economy is meaningless because there is high degree of inequality and there's high degree of unemployment and continuing poverty. So whether we are the fourth largest, fifth largest, or the ninth largest, the lot of the poor remains quite poor, and therefore this claim of being fourth largest becomes meaningless for them. Thank you very much.